Welcome to the third Nisos Advanced Persistent Talk videocast. I'm Landon Winklevoss, co-founder of Nisos, and will be today's host. We bring 3 to 5 subject matter experts between vendors and industry in a panel style discussion on one hot topic in investigations for cybersecurity. Today's topic will be the discussion on intelligence-driven attribution in the world of security and safety. Medium and large enterprises face threats at a global scale, and depending on the business model and culture of the organization, attribution can be certainly a controversial topic. Depending on the level of malice, there are usually only limited options for security teams within the enterprise, and today we'll get into some of those options. Joining me on the panel today is Stephanie Olson, Trust and Safety Manager at Netflix. Next, we have Christine Leslie, Information Security Manager at Tesla, followed by Matt Brock, Managing Director for Nisos. And rounding out the team, we have Levi Gundert, Global Vice President of Intelligence at Recorded Futures. So kind of diving in to the questions, Christine will be the first to take with Stephanie, and then Levi and Matt Brock following on. What are your thoughts on attribution, the lens of security and trust and safety? Do you feel it's important to attribute fraudsters, threat actors, tools, techniques, and motivations? And frankly, when's it appropriate to pursue attribution? And what are the typical outcomes?
First, I should say that the views that I discussed today are my own and are not representative of Tesla's views. Certainly, certainly based on some of my experiences, but only representative of my own views. So when you talk about attribution, I think it's incredibly important. A lot of times when incidents occur, the focus can really be on, how do we fix the incident, making sure that, functionality is restored, the issue is resolved, making sure that operational pace continues. But, I think that equally important is understanding, the who and the how. And when you talk about how, I think that really in the business context is the most important. Understanding tools, techniques, trends, because I think that if you don't invest in the upfront in understanding why this incident occurred and how this incident occurred, you're doomed to repeat the same mistakes or have the same incident occur over and over again. I think when you talk about who to understanding motivations can be extraordinarily important. So, I think that having that understanding can help you. The best offense is a good defense. So I think that understanding that can really help an organization be better defended and better understand, the threats that are being posed.
I'll just follow on. First, I'll kind of give the same intro as Christine to let you know that these are also views of my own and certainly aren't necessarily representative of Netflix as a business, but based on my own experience and my own personal views. In terms of attribution, I would say, there's many different threat actors that can target many different companies or businesses, and I think it really depends on the kind of business that you have and the kind of threats that actually come after your business. So there is a time and place where identifying the specifics is really important. So if you think about the world of child exploitation or really high risk scenarios where there's personal safety at large, or things that are high risk to people or to businesses. In those areas, I think that, looking at the very, very specifics and following that can be a very vital part of making sure that there is trust and safety that occurs. Thankfully, most of the fraud that I deal with on a day-to-day basis really is about kind of the attacks around gaining access to information, or they really just warrant more of a high level association. So to Christine's point, really looking at like tools or trends or data or attack types, I think those are things that we more so look into. The fraud also, of course, moves very quickly. And so in cases where you're looking kind of at scale at attacks, there isn't a whole lot of time to be looking at who's behind the lens of this particular instance. And so it can be challenging to try to think of like doing a traditional sort of threat intelligence around a sort of large scale credential stuffing attack, right? Because by the time you actually get through all of those particulars of the investigation, that fraudster has moved on to something else and they're doing it in a different way. And so it can be very, very challenging. I would say we as such, do more of that generalization of techniques and data and attributes that can be associated with different attacks. And then we use that as our own kind of intelligence to make sure that we're catching the next bad actor.
Yeah, just to follow on what was said there. So Christine made a great point about motivation. I think that motivation really does inform methodology. And in the threat intelligence world, there's obviously different levels of attribution. You can be very granular with it if you want. In the public sector, there's obviously a need to be very granular with attribution. You know, this week, DOJ came out with multiple indictments against Chinese nationals and 2 Iranian nationals, I believe. That's the type of attribution that the public sector needs, you know, whether it's military, intelligence organizations, law enforcement organizations. But I think in the private sector, there's sort of a point of diminishing returns when it comes to attribution. Obviously, if you're talking about physical safety and, you know, the risk to executives, or, you know, you're looking at following specific fraud trends, to Stephanie's point, then more granular attribution can be very helpful. But of course, you're always thinking about what are the outcomes. And in general, when it comes to information security outcomes, it's helpful to generally understand a group or an individual down to the region or the country they operate in, again, to identify that motivation that Christine was talking about. But beyond that, it's generally not super helpful. So the private sector generally doesn't need a name, an address, you know, pictures, really, because there's not a lot of outcomes that can be derived from it. So I think you have to, you know, generally think about the industry that you're in and what type of security you're talking about, you know, to understand whether it's valuable to spend the resources on, you know, a particular type of attribution.
Following up on that, you know, it will often depend on the desires of the customer and the needs of the customer, and particularly if they do want something very detailed or not. But I'd argue that if you are a third party, especially if you're a third party security company, you'll want to at least have the ability to reach attribution down to the individual level or to the actor or signature level, simply because even if most times a private sector company doesn't want that information, the times that they do, you'll want to have kind of the muscle memory to be able to give them the attribution they're looking for. And attribution fundamentally is just means connecting the dots or putting the puzzle pieces together, which means that you either have to have the puzzle pieces in advance, or you need to have relationships with the quote unquote puzzle piece owners, in other words, data set or tool companies that can provide you with the information. So like, for example, FBI after 9/11, you know, they were able to pull the boarding pass info from the hijacked planes. They were able to match it to passport and then to visa data, and then to hotel records, to the flight schools, to the credit card companies, et cetera. And they were able to build out a picture pretty quickly of who the hijackers were and what they had done since they entered the US. And that attribution was possible because they either had the data already or they had the relationships set in advance to be able to pull that data quickly. So all that to say that if you are going to be called upon to do attribution, the time to start compiling the puzzle pieces, is not after a breach or a threat, but well in advance.
And I guess that's the question, I guess, to go to Stephanie and Christine. I guess, how do you kind of look at attribution in terms of, clearly there's got to be a threshold, right? Start with Stephanie, I guess. What kind of threshold do you generally put in terms of saying, okay, we're going to actually, you know, take more aggressive steps to define, you know, to go a little bit beyond, you know, the how and the why, and maybe potentially to the who?
I think it really does fall on your ability to quantify the risk, right? And the risk associated with a particular incident or a particular threat. So drawing back on, you know, whether or not there is high risk against people or the business. You know, it could be potentially related to a high risk that creates monetary loss for a company. I think when you tip over a particular threshold, and that will be unique depending on, you know, who you are and how you operate, there becomes a point at which there's agreement, broad agreement in your leadership group that this is the place at which we need to invest more specifically in attribution to be able to draw those lines. I think Matt gave a great example, obviously, in the situation of 9/11. Those are easily identifiable situations where that attribution is key, right, to the safety of the United States of America. So something along those lines, or something that creates a high risk, certainly there's valid there.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Stephanie. I completely agree. I mean, I think it really depends on the impact of the event itself and the outcome that you're looking to get. So, if it's an event that has a huge impact on your business, whether it's a monetary loss, whether it's something that impacts operations and halts operations in your factory or something to that effect, there might be there might be additional pressure from your stakeholders to be able to identify, who actually is behind that incident. If it's one of the incidents that we look into every single day, the threshold might be a little bit different. I think that when we're talking about physical security risks, the who obviously becomes much more important. If you're dealing with a direct threat to a building, an individual, something to that effect, understanding who's behind the anonymous account, or the anonymous Twitter account, or what have you, is a lot more important, because you might want that outcome to be a referral to law enforcement. So I think that the overall impact of the business, as well as sort of the desired outcome, really drives how far the team takes the who, and really driving down into who's behind an event that occurs in your business.
Moving on to the next question with Stephanie and then Christine, followed by Levi and Matt. Understanding mature security and safety organizations have a range of threats on a global scale. What types of threats do you see, and how do you use intelligence to combat those threats?
Yeah, so, first I'll mention, I've been in the trust and safety world for about 10 years, always on the merchant side, always in the tech industry or entertainment industry. So it could be different, in different industries. But for me, really over the last 10 years, I would say the threats remain the same, and just the jockeying of position is the thing that changes, right? So whether it's the top threat or the fourth threat, may change over time. But most of the time, we've seen pretty consistent threats in the trust and safety world. I would say there are three things really that I think about in terms of the way that fraudsters attack, merchants and companies. They think about the exploitation of the economic and emotional state of the world, right? So can I take advantage of what's going on out there that may be altering the way that customers engage with technology or engage with a particular merchant or business? They think about exploiting human vulnerabilities, empathies that we have, where we may have relationships with people, we may be interested in reaching out to people, we may be interested in communicating with people in certain ways. And then they obviously look to exploit business weaknesses, right? So they look to try and figure out, where is a business weak along the lines, and how can I actually create some monetization off of all of that? And so when I think about kind of what are those threats, really I think there's like 4 to 5 areas that I've consistently focused on. Account takeover is certainly a hot topic. I would say within the last 5 years, it's become really the #1 attack vector for fraudsters. Lots of credentials available out there in the dark web, lots of information, people aren't as educated as they should be about how to keep their information secure, and lots of ways for fraudsters to use that information if they take over an account. So that's definitely one. Generally, payment fraud, using stolen methods of payment, I think is always going to be something that we have to worry about. Phishing scams, really the reach out to consumers and to people to pretend to be a trusted brand when they are not, and really leveraging that trust that you as a brand have created with your consumer, but unfortunately now might be breached because of phishing. And then along those lines, spam, I think, is a key one. It always surprises me that the Nigerian prince still gets his $1 million every year, right? Like there's so many people that click on those emails. I just don't understand it. But also, obviously I've been in the world of security for a decade, so perhaps I'm not the average user. And then another area that I think is a place where certainly companies focus on is a DDoS prevention, right? Distributed denial of service prevention. I think the ability to keep your infrastructure up and running and keep your information safe and your product online is a really vital part of the trust aspect of the trust and safety. And so those are places that I would say are pretty consistent. If I had to pick a place that I see kind of the upwards trend of threats, it's not something that we deal with specifically at Netflix, but misinformation and disinformation, I think, is something over the past few years that has become much more prevalent in the trust and safety world. Misinformation really just being, false information that's spread unintentionally, right? So that there's no malicious intent or intent to mislead there, but it happens because people don't understand that that's actually not accurate information. And then, of course, disinformation being with the intent to actually influence the audience or create some kind of deception, right? And so I think those are a couple areas that are really important and vital for certainly folks that work in the types of industries that I work in to be focused on to keep consumers safe in the future.
As I was listening to you, Stephanie, I think that it really is broken down into 3 different categories for me, right? These are threats of opportunity, these are directed threats, and then in that last category that you were just talking about on disinformation, it's almost like an inadvertent threat. So, I think that when you're thinking about how you can use intelligence to address each one of those, I think the first category, threats of opportunity and inadvertent, and the last category on inadvertent threats is really difficult, right? Both in my career, both in the private sector as well as in the government, on threats of opportunity, you see a lot of bad actors, whether it be nation states, whether it be criminal actors looking to conduct fraud, looking to get a quick buck. Oftentimes taking advantage of vulnerabilities that they just happen to come across. And so I think that when you're talking about how you defend yourself, how you use intelligence in order to best defend against that kind of threat, it becomes very difficult. I mean, the best that you can do is ensure that you have good cybersecurity hygiene, you have good processes in place in order to not only protect your defenses as well as to ensure that you can deal swiftly, appropriately with those events as they occur. But I think on intelligence, it becomes that part becomes difficult. On directed threats, when you're looking at people who are really out to say, hey, like me, Mr. Bad Actor or Miss Bad Actor, I'm looking to go after this company, whether it's Netflix or Tesla or a government entity. I think that's where the intelligence can really play a role. Obviously, there's a host of different third parties that you can use to understand, how bad actors are targeting your industry, whether that's automotive, whether that's the entertainment industry, to be able to identify trends, threats, and to be able to better enable your defenses. I think that there's also a certain amount of sort of self-generated intelligence, and this is about, this goes back to the first topic that we were discussing, which is really, as you are seeing different things occur across your ecosystem, it could be phishing, like Stephanie was mentioning before, it could be phishing, it could be DDoS. Sometimes these threat actors are looking, across in a number of different places. So having those programs in place in order to, sort of look across your your ecosystem, if you will, to be able to identify those trends, be able to have a place to document that kind of stuff, to make that stuff searchable, can help you generate your own intelligence as well. But on the sort of the inadvertent side and the threats of opportunity, you might get lucky, with open source monitoring of the dark web, for example, seeing people that are out there, conducting DDoS attacks or phishing, or using your customers' credentials in different places. But I think that the monitoring open source is one way to take a look at it. But I think it's a really challenging issue.
I don't want this to turn into a scare fest, but there are plenty of threats to go around. It's hard to choose a couple. I think, Stephanie was talking about obviously the threats that clients face. And when you're talking about fraud, trying to maintain a brand, maintain the security of the brand with your clients is really important. It's also really difficult. I think from our perspective at Recorded Future, the threats that we see, really going after confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information within companies and enterprises themselves, there's just so much there right now. And I think if, to get specific, ransomware is just incredibly hot within the underground economy right now because the monetization factor is so high and it happens, relatively quickly. 20 years ago, there was so much interest in carding and different types of fraud. Today, a lot of that interest is moving into ransomware. And we're really seeing a whole economy sort of spring up where actors are offering unauthorized access for sale in increasing volumes. And most of the people buying that unauthorized access are looking to deliver ransomware payloads into the environment. So when you think about threats, obviously, it really comes back to risk and loss, and organizations, think about, do we have mitigating security controls in place? And when you think about something like ransomware, the answer is very complex. There's a lot of things that happen before ransomware is actually delivered into your environment. So it may be a phishing email, it may be a exploited vulnerability, it may be credential reuse. But once that initial unauthorized access happens, you get persistence, you get lateral movement, you get the introduction of first stage payload. First stage payload fetches a piece of ransomware. So there's a lot of things you can be doing. We use this term left of boom. There's a lot of things you can be doing, and that's really where intelligence comes into play, is making sure that you're holistically trying to address that threat from a security control perspective. And I think you can't really have a great understanding of what your security controls are at any given point in time and be able to identify your gaps if you don't have intelligence, if you're not understanding what that left of boom looks like, and all the ways that you can be detecting and hunting for that activity prior to the actual ransomware payload. I think the other one that's big is business email compromise. So we see a lot, and the thing about business email compromise is it's probably much more prolific than we know of, just because ransomware tends to be such a public event. You see a lot of public reporting on it. When it comes to business email compromise, I think a lot of organizations are losing a lot of money directly from accounts payable, but you might not necessarily hear about it in the news. And that's really an interesting problem because, it is social engineering at the end of the day. And if an adversary can further the scheme by maybe getting on your internal mail server and sending that email that is apparently from the CEO, it sure is a lot more compelling. But there's a lot of companies losing a lot of money because they think they're paying a legitimate vendor to the tune of millions of dollars. So I think those two are two very timely threats. And then just to pile on to what Christine and Stephanie said, disinformation and information operations continues to be something that is challenging, I think, as an industry to address. And especially for companies, we've actually seen this in the criminal space where criminals are spinning up sort of a disinformation as a service themselves, where they will spin up people who write articles, people who can generate deep fake videos or images, and not just pushing this into social media, but actually gaining adoption within mainstream media. It's really impressive to sort of watch. So obviously nation states sort of started this trend, but criminals have been quick to adopt it as well. So, for example, you sell brake pads and your competitor decides that they want to start a campaign to try and, impugn the quality of your brake pads. It's pretty simple to spin that up and buy that service in the underground economy these days. So that's another interesting threat to watch out for.
What was interesting leaving government, coming into private sector, is that the range of threats are still very important, but they're much more narrow than what a government would look for. I mean, the government often desires knowledge for its own sake, just in case they need it one day. Like they'll assign analysts to watch a small country or a small group, just in case there's a coup or another issue that'll bring that issue to national policymaker attention. And it's not private companies' job to be Wikipedia like that. Like instead, they want to focus on things that directly affect their bottom line, either reputationally or financially. So the term that we've all heard, bottom line up front, which in the government context refers to the style of writing that puts analytic conclusions front of center. It's also useful shorthand for people transitioning from government to private sector intelligence work, which is, remember, private sector is going to be focused on threats that directly affect or have the potential to affect the ability of a company to generate profits. But even within that more narrow scope, there's huge room for intelligence collection and analysis of threats. So we can stay quite busy, even if we don't have to be all things to all people like we were in government. And I'm going to foot stomp what everyone else has already mentioned, which is the issue of reputational issues or disinformation. Just the psychology of the human mind, we're incredibly susceptible to suggestion and to the opinions of others. We're always incredibly attuned to what people say, who the in-group is, who the out-group is in any situation. And then you combine kind of our psychology, which was adapted for a group of 20 to 100 people max, to being able to access the thoughts of everybody on Twitter, and the way information can spread so quickly. It can really catch companies completely off guard if they're not paying attention. So in terms of how to resolve threats, here at Nisos, we break down the idea of misinformation into 4 parts, which is narrative, outlet, accounts, and signatures. So narrative is what is being said. Outlet is the blogs or the websites that originate or disseminate information. Accounts are the social media users or the social media bots that are spreading the information. And then signatures are the technical fingerprints of the outlets or the accounts that we can help track or block. And if necessary, all of those can lead to attribution of the actual individuals behind it. But it's just interesting that we've all independently come to this conclusion that disinformation is going to be a pretty significant threat going forward. And so we need to start breaking it down into its constituent parts and having a game plan for how to combat it, or at least track what's being said about our companies.
I think that kind of leads to the next question. I mean, I think, in a geopolitical world, intelligence is actioned in, some type of economic, diplomatic, military, or covert outcome. I mean, and I think we're just kind of talking about this as well on the disinformation front, like what Russia did in 2016, is now kind of spreading, certainly to the business, business community. More broadly though, how does intelligence result in better business outcomes, and what qualitative and quantitative metrics are useful to show progress that, frankly, that the board has an understanding of, understanding that very few cases, actually make it to law enforcement. Levi, I know you've kind of spoken a lot about this, Matt, and then Christine, and then Stephanie to follow.
Thanks, Lena. I am pretty passionate about this topic. I came out of government, I worked in law enforcement, and, I was involved in intelligence, and the outcomes were very direct. Everyone understood what the purpose of the intelligence was for. And I think threat intelligence is still somewhat nascent as an industry, and we don't necessarily, as an industry, have a great understanding of what it is we're trying to accomplish with it. And by that, again, you said in the geopolitical world, and sometimes even in the fraud world, things are a little bit more straightforward. But when it comes to, intelligence to protect internal assets in the internal organization, again, it's really about risk and loss. So when you think strategically about intelligence, what are you actually producing, and what is the outcome? So a lot of organizations today produce intelligence reports. They produce a daily report. They may produce ad hoc reporting on threats, but it's sometimes unclear, who reads the reports, and more importantly, what the outcomes of the reports are. So if the ultimate goal of the intelligence program is to raise awareness, it kind of doesn't have any teeth, right? There's not a lot to measure there. We use this term a lot in the industry, actionable. Intelligence needs to be actionable. But what that really means is you need to have outcomes that you can measure and communicate. So if you can't measure it and you can't communicate it, it's kind of worthless. So I think there's a lot of good intentions out there and a lot of good activity, but it doesn't necessarily result in anything substantive. So I'll give you an example that I talk about just as an example. So if you're producing an intelligence report, maybe on security implications for moving your gaming operations from Las Vegas to Macau, that's certainly important intelligence input, to a very critical business decision, right? But how much that report influences the decision, how much that input is measured, feedback to the team, generally that cycle is not there. Similarly, maybe you're considering upgrading 100,000 workstations from Windows 7 to Windows 10. Is there a security case to be made for that? Is there an intelligence component of that? Probably, right? But how is the decision measured, and how is that input measured in the decision? So I think a lot of what intelligence should be doing today is leading to operational outcomes, again, that can be measured and that can be communicated. So for example, I talked earlier about adversary TTPs, right? The tools, the tactics, the techniques that adversaries use, and the evolutions of those TTPs. So obviously, intelligence plays a fundamental role in being able to identify adversary TTPs and the evolutions. But how do you measure it? So using sort of the incident response type of metrics, I would say mean time to surface and mean time to assess. Meaning, if an adversary is open sourcing a new tool or selling a new piece of malware on a Monday morning, how long does it take the team to become aware of that? And then how long does it take to actually obtain, right, said malware, to do an assessment of the malware, to determine, do our security controls actually stack up the way that we think they do against this new threat or this new threat evolution? And that's really the process of threat intelligence, right? Which is a little different from business intelligence, right? And there's obviously geopolitical intelligence, but when it comes to cyber threat intelligence, that's really the key, is being able to measure those things, and then ultimately being able to translate what's happening in that program into the language of risk for the business. Because at the end of the day, the business cares about one thing, which is, are we going to lose money? And if so, how much? That's what the business cares about. Whether it's reputational loss, whether it's outage to systems and operations, whether it's fees or penalties on the regulatory side or the compliance side, whatever it is, it really, it all boils down into numbers. And that's really what the board cares about, is, are we going to lose money? How much? So there's kind of a disconnect that's happened, and that's information security in general, between what they're doing and what the business is hearing. And I think Stephanie mentioned it earlier, quantifying risk becomes really important, because now you're able to show we've implemented these controls, and we have the intelligence to tell us that our controls are effective. If we didn't have controls, these are the types of losses we'd be looking at. These are the losses we're currently projecting based on the controls that we have. And if we added these controls, the delta between what we have and what we're proposing, right, would do this in terms of loss amounts. Now, a lot of people the CSO doesn't necessarily want to run into the board and say, okay, these are the hard and fast loss amounts for the year based on our current, control set. But it's nice for the CSO to have those numbers, to be able to measure things, on a normal cadence, to understand when we make a change in security controls, or when the adversary TTPs change and evolve, and we have that gap, what that potentially does to loss. Even if you're not going to quantitatively try and explain that to the board, which is its own challenge in and of itself, even if you're just going to qualify it, it's really nice for the CSO to be able to feel confident about investing resources in the right places, not wasting resources on threats that you already have security controls for, and also, being able to understand what sort of risk tolerance the organization has. Because I think that's really the goal of intelligence, right, is to reduce the risk for the business, and you got to do that in a measurable way.
There's a lot of things you could say about this topic, but I wanted to focus in on an aspect of intelligence work that can be a little bit counterintuitive, which is how information from a security team can contribute to improving a company's culture, which is, it's very hard to quantify how much a good company culture results in, in improved bottom line, but it's easy to qualify it in the sense everyone wants to work for a good company, no one wants to work for a bad company. So, everyone's heard the quote, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's attributed to this guy named W. Edwards Deming. I went and looked it up, and it turns out that a lot of people quote it wrong. The full quote is, "It is wrong to suppose that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That's a costly myth." So he was this famous engineer who helped Japan's economy get back on its feet after World War II. And he was a huge proponent of metrics and measuring data. But in all the factories that he helped, he had this thing called the system of profound knowledge that had 4 components that he applied to these businesses to improve their quality and cut their costs. And 3 of these were 100% related to quantitative aspects that can be measured. But the 4th was called a knowledge of psychology. So I would argue for sure that data and metrics are hugely important for business, but we have to be open to qualitative or even almost intuitive markers that can alert us to danger or threats well before it shows up in the metrics. Like if you're the information security team and you notice people aren't using strong passwords, or some people aren't updating, doing their security training on time, does that tell you anything just intuitively about perhaps apathy, indifference? If there's, how do you measure disgruntlement? How do you take the measure of someone's ego or capability for resentment, for acting out against a bad boss, or after being passed over for promotion? That's not necessarily going to show up on a dashboard, but a well-trained investigator looking at insider threats may be able to pick up on things that if they were only focused on things that can be turned into numbers, they might miss. So it's combining what they see in the quantitative data with the knowledge of psychology to provide alerts to boards that can tell them maybe there's something going on with the company's culture. And there's the famous quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." So if the security team is able to provide advance warning to a company about problems in a company culture, then fixing it can have a profound effect on the bottom line.
I think to add to Levi said something, about reducing risk for the business in a measurable way being incredibly important. And, I couldn't agree more. And I think that depending on the business that you're in, as Matt was talking about, understanding what's important to the business, understanding what that threshold of risk is also really important. I think that, you want to use Intel in order to understand what those risks are, and allowing really the business to make informed operational decisions about risk. So, my former life being in the government, I don't think that intelligence is entirely, that different in the private sector. Really, the reason that you have intelligence is to really enable operations, really to be able to enable, what it is that your business outcomes are. Certainly there are some differences, like we've talked about in these previous 2 questions about, addressing the who and why of nefarious activity. But I think, really when it comes down to it, the intelligence is really to really enable the business and to make informed decisions about risk. And we're talking, when we're talking about measuring it, certainly I think that in stark contrast to the government, the best way that we can possibly quantify it is in a quantitative way, right? I mean, if we can say, hey, listen, we're saving the business, $1 million based on the fact that we were able to proactively identify this issue. Certainly, that's going to hit home with your senior stakeholders and with the board in a meaningful way. But even if you're not able to specifically quantify it, I think that ensuring that you have a way to be able to measure the intel activities that your team is undertaking or that you're undertaking with a third party is really important to be able to measure the progress of your program.
From my perspective, I always think of metrics and measurements kind of in three levels, right? So at the bottom level, we have operational metrics, right? So things that influence the work that gets done on a day-to-day basis. And then when you kind of take the next level up, you're looking at business level metrics, right? What is the health of the business? How are things operating from a business perspective? And then that next level is really kind of your executive, C-suite, board level metrics, right? So how do I help executives understand the risk mitigation to the company, to our customers, et cetera? I think that in the world of threat intelligence, it can help you very much be informed of some of those operational metrics, right? And understanding, I think both Levi and Christine touched upon it, understanding how do you take that intelligence and then interpret that to actual quantifiable information so that it influences the day-to-day operation or the month-to-month or the overall health of the business. And so I think that there is some level of that can occur. I also do think, though, that it is a challenge, right? It's a big challenge with being able to actually extrapolate that information in a way that makes meaningful change for your workforce, for your threat intel team, for your fraud team. And so that's a continuous evolution. Another place that I've seen and used threat intelligence to kind of help move the dial a bit is when it comes to areas that you want to measure that aren't as easy or maybe as straightforward. So there are things that your business, likely cares about, cost, retention, engagement. Those things can in some way be a little bit more straightforward in terms of the way that you actually go about that measurement. But then you look at things like brand reputation, right? And you say, well, how do I actually put a dollar amount that the board is going to be able to associate the impact of this to our brand? And that's where I think also you can use some level of threat intel to aggregate some information that's qualitative and really bring that together from a qualitative standpoint, and then try to extrapolate out from that on what that means from a quantitative perspective so that you can build that into your suite of metrics that you're presenting to your various forces. So for me, I think there's a few places that you can use threat intel. I definitely would agree with Levi where it's challenging. It's a continuous evolution. I think it's important, but there's still quite a bit of disconnect that needs to be overcome. So it's just an area we need to keep pressing on from a security perspective.
Stephanie, one question I have as a follow-on point, when it comes to trust and safety and of the workforce and the business reputation, which is what you live on a day-to-day basis, I guess what are some examples of how you've you quantified the risk and kind of run that up the chain where it ultimately feeds your program and it has had a effect on the bottom line, but also as Matt kind of.
Yeah, I think if we kind of like boil down to like specific attack types and risks that are associated with that in a given business. So if you take on, for instance, account takeover, right, and the wave at which credential stuffing and password spraying and different tooling has become available, right? So there's many influences that have occurred in the real world that have increased the risk holistically across companies, and then more so for specific companies and whatnot. And so taking that information and being able to really glean from it around how much information is available in the dark web, who are the threat actors that are leveraging this information, how has the translation of the dark web and the popularity of the dark web and that ecosystem really influence the overall attack surface, right? And the availability of these like attack tools, right? It's super easy. I mean, if you just Google on YouTube, if you just do a search on YouTube for like, how do I do credential stuffing, you'll get like a whole bunch of, information around how to do certain things. And so it's really sort of that collation of information and then taking that and interpreting that into how is that impacting my business, right? So how is that actually impacting my customers? How is it impacting my brand? Why should we care about that? And to the earlier point that Levi made, taking that and associating that with okay, now what is the risk to the business? What are the controls we need to put in place in order to mitigate this risk? And then after you do that, being able to tell that story very effectively, I think is a great way also just to build your internal trust, right? So that people can understand what's actually happening. Take that information, say, this is what I think we need to do. And then after you've invested some in that space, being able to then translate that to say, hey, look at the wins that we've had here, right? Because we've taken this approach. And so let's continue to do more of that to be able to improve our business and our customer base and the trust of our overall brand.
Christine, I'm sure you have probably similar examples as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's, when you're talking about Intel, certainly in the government sense, there's a whole host of different methods that you can go about that are not necessarily appropriate for the culture of Silicon Valley. So I think that you really need to be able to understand what, it goes back to what we were talking about before. It's about understanding the culture of the business, understanding what's important to the business. So, if intellectual property and confidential business information are the most important things to the business, identifying intelligence surrounding whether that's signals on your network, whether that's third-party open source type data that you're looking at, whether that's a whole host of different things. I think that understanding really what's the most important thing to your business, and then developing the intelligence around there appropriately. And then when you're to your question about going back and talking about specifically about measuring that, I think again, being able to measure that in a way that that's meaningful to your C-suite. So whether it's reducing the amount of fraud that you're seeing on a day-to-day basis, whether that's reducing the attacks that you have on your manufacturing facility. I think that those the metrics that you gather should be directly correlated to really what's important to the business as a whole.
And we got a little bit of time to go into a little bit of questions and answers. And we have Stephanie, Matt Brock, and Levi on the line as well. Question, I guess, for Stephanie here's posed. Netflix is an industry leader in data and collection. Do you apply these tools to the world of trust and safety? Are you collecting data on fraudsters and using that data to build in protections? It's probably very similar to any SOC that collects on APT 1 through 30, 39, or are you guys kind of doing something similar with fraud actors?
So yeah, so first I'd say I don't know if I would quantify Netflix as a leader in data collection, but I would certainly say that at Netflix we use data a lot to make decisions for a variety of different things. We're really good, I think, at balancing the use of data between the fraud and security needs that we have, and of course the privacy and regulatory concerns that exist. So Netflix is in a great position in that we really are able to be very nimble with our user base, and we don't have a lot of we don't have multiple strings, right? So some companies have multiple product lines or they have advertising, we don't have any of that. So we don't have this need to really collect a whole bunch of information. But in the information that we do collect, we're very strategic about just making sure that that's able to be used in ways for us to identify fraudulent activity. So there's a combination, I think, a combined approach in various trust and safety teams that use, in-house solutions and third-party solutions. And so, that combination of information and analysis allows us to really drive through and identify fraud in a very strategic way. For most folks that deal with kind of the at scale sort of, trust and safety issues with fraudsters, things like, country of origin or location of where a fraudster comes from are usually less relevant, right? So, and the main reason is there's a lot of spoofing, fraudsters can, quote unquote, be from all over the world, things like that. So, so we don't specifically look at like, country specific attack surfaces. We try to really look at information that could be to help us identify different techniques and attacks across, sort of the global panel. So, yes.
That's very helpful. Moving on to the next question, Levi, this will go to you first. When have you decided to pursue litigation against fraudster? And of course, understand you're on the vendor side. I'm just curious where you've seen that play out. Working with your clients at a high level, and do you see do you do so when is there a certain monetary threshold released? And have you seen this at all, at all dissuade threat actors?
Sure. So I think, based on my experience in the financial services sector, prior to Recorded Future, I think what you want to be doing is just maintaining an ongoing relationship with law enforcement. And, generally that's federal law enforcement. It can be the FBI or Secret Service. It could be Homeland Security, HSI, their investigations group. But having contacts in a federal law enforcement agency and just keeping communication open is really important, because I think it generally tends to be less about certain limits or thresholds on your side, and it tends to be much more about what the fraud losses or fraud amounts are on their side, because ultimately they're going to be generally happy to work with you on specific cases. I'll give you an example, like NeverQuest, right? That was a piece of malware that caused quite a bit of fraud loss for a lot of different organizations, and law enforcement has an interest in actively pursuing that case. But when it comes to indictments, they have to go to an assistant United States attorney and present the case, and that AUSA is going to have their own set of thresholds, based on the city that you're in. Every AUSA is different. While you can certainly try to prosecute a case locally with a district attorney, generally speaking, when you're working with federal law enforcement, their resources mean that they work with an AUSA. So it's really about what the AUSA thinks on the threshold. In LA, the threshold for verifiable fraud loss used to be very high. $1 million or $500,000, depending on exactly what type of fraud you're talking about. But again, just having those communication lines open, making sure that you're proactively communicating, even if it's not going to turn into a case. You're providing yourself optionality in the event that you do have a big case, and you are able to provide significant insight into it to help law enforcement get that case started and ultimately sell it to an AUSA.
Stephanie, anything different to add on to that? You guys kind of have similar methodology from that perspective?
Yeah, I would say I have a very, similar methodology and thought process. I think, over the last decade, as I've worked in, various trust and safety teams and partnered with various law enforcement, I think it's important to have that relationship for, specific situations. I think also there is a level, like a threshold level at which it makes sense to really, partner with law enforcement and be able to help enable them to do what's necessary. Certainly in a lot of general like trust and safety attacks, I would say there isn't a strong enough case, right, to be able to go after all these different kinds of fraudsters. But when it comes to issues dealing with physical goods, you can put a quantified number against how much is actually being being stolen or being sold illegally, then it makes it a little bit easier, I think. And of course, law enforcement is the experts in kind of guiding and telling you like this, this would meet a threshold, this is an area we could help you with, and whatnot. And so I think it's important in certain situations for sure.
Final question. Have you seen a shift in the types of amount of fraud since the pandemic started, Stephanie?
I think generally fraudsters try to capitalize on, vulnerable situations, right? I think I talked about a little about this in the webinar here, but capitalizing on places where, human beings feel vulnerable, then it is really good for fraudsters. So, as such, attack surfaces like phishing attacks, right, can increase at times when people are feeling, vulnerable and emotional, and certainly a global pandemic is one of those times, right? And so it's just increasingly important, I think, for us as professionals in the trust and safety world to be helping to continue to educate people across the board, whether they interact with your business or whether they just simply are on the internet interacting with their email or other websites or whatnot. It's extremely important for people to understand where they can be scammed, where they can be taken advantage of, and to be aware that those shifts do happen when there is outside pressure on the ecosystem. And so right now is a good time for people to really be aware that that fraud has increased and will stay increased as we work through this global pandemic.
We got 1 minute left. Question to Matt, since you're in the disinformation space, in terms of the administratively, what can companies do to take action against disinformation campaigns? I mean, is it really just about account expulsion, or is there? And do you see any type of anything that do you think anything type of cease and desist letters or any legal legal options that companies have?
That's a great question. I mean, it depends, I think, on what kind of company you are. Obviously, if you have access to, if you're a company that's actually providing the platform for disinformation to spread, then you have the option of removing that content yourself. If you don't have access to that, then setting up lines of communication with such companies would be very important. But I think for companies that don't have either of those options, or are too small to, or are just starting out, naming and shaming could be useful, or at least, at the very least, putting out information regarding kind of breaking down the series of falsehoods that may have been spread in order to stay on top of rumors or of negative press that may be coming out about your company. A good example of that might be the Wayfair mini scandal that happened a couple months ago, where people were able to jump on that and debunk the conspiracy theory that went viral around that company. So if consumers are only hearing one side of the story, then they may be more likely to believe it if they don't hear something from your company directly.
Awesome. Well, it's the top of the hour. Stephanie, Levi, Matt, and of course, Christine, thank you very much for joining us. And this concludes the webinar. You guys everybody have a great day.